Hi, this is Rob Carolina. I want to talk to you about making the most of your experience as a student competitor in the Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge. In this talk, I'm going to begin with a little bit of background about the competition. I want to talk about why compete at all, how to work with evidence, understanding context, how to present your ideas. I'll give you some ideas about choosing a team and a coach, and then finish with a few final thoughts about your role in the competition. Let's begin with just a little bit of background. I'm a lawyer and a specialist in laws that apply to information technology and cybersecurity. I've been a teacher for more than 20 years, and I've developed an MSc module on legal and regulatory aspects of cybersecurity. I'm also the author of CyBOK 1.0, Law and Regulation Knowledge Area. I've been involved with the competition a number of times as a coach, twice in London, once in Geneva. In addition to the teams that I've coached, which you see here on the slide, I have debriefed other teams that came from our university, and at these competitions I spent time watching multiple teams compete. I'm passionate about the competition because of the education benefits that it can provide to you. The competition itself is an annual cyber policy and strategy competition where students compete in developing policy recommendations tackling a fictional cyber catastrophe. It's multiple competitions, individual competitions around the world that are convened by local supporters using a common framework developed by the Atlantic Council. The competition is an analysis and reporting exercise. So as a competitor, you don't conduct a forensic investigation of computer systems. You instead receive a raw intelligence pack that has a lot of real and simulated reports from a number of different sources. And then you conduct independent background research and study in advance of the competition to prepare you for it. As you can read in the rules, the competition proceeds through 3 rounds. In the first round, you receive your first intelligence pack. You have many weeks to prepare. So you need to research and write 2 short reports, a situation analysis, which is due in advance, and a recommendations document that you deliver in the room to the judges when you arrive at the competition. And during those weeks, you also prepare to give an in-person briefing, and you prepare for a question and answer session with the judges. If you advance to round 2, you'll receive a second, supplemental intelligence pack that gives you more information. You then have only 1 night to revise your written recommendations and prepare for a second briefing and question and answer session. If you advance to the final round, you're given a third supplemental intelligence pack, and you have only a matter of minutes to read and understand what you've been given and prepare your final briefing and question and answer session. Naturally, you might be wondering, why compete at all? Why participate in this competition? In the run-up to the actual competition days, you'll have an opportunity to research and study a broad variety of subjects related to cyber threats. You're also going to learn about subjects outside of your domain expertise. You're going to be required to analyze, synthesize, and report based on heterogeneous sources of information. When you get to the competition itself, you'll be faced with a controlled simulation presenting your ideas and answering difficult questions from judges who have a lot of professional experience in this space. After you leave the room and give them a chance to collect their thoughts, you then come back and you get feedback from these same experts about what just happened. The competition will give you some career-enhancing skills. It's going to help you with your written and oral presentation skills. It'll help you with your teamwork. It'll test you by giving you questions under pressure. The competition will probably move you outside of your comfort zone. And it's an opportunity to meet people, to network, and to have fun. So let's talk a bit about working with evidence. You're going to be required to review the evidence that's available to you. That comes in the intelligence pack created by the competition organizers. As you look through that packet of information, consider each source's credibility. Consider the source's focus and subject matter expertise, and consider how to weigh those factors as you consider what to believe and how much weight to put on these various sources of information. So, for example, consider the types of things you might look at would be a forensic report by a technical expert, or a tabloid newspaper article, a police intelligence report, satellite reconnaissance image, an antivirus company report. Any of these things might form part of the competition intelligence pack. You then have to synthesize the evidence that you've been given. And you have to answer some basic questions. What things do we believe have happened out there in the field? What was the impact of those things? How do we grade the risk moving forward? What sort of risks or potential events do we see on the horizon based on the evidence so far? And always important, what, if anything, can we say about attribution at this stage? What evidence do we have about who is responsible for what we're looking at? I recommend that you adopt a consistent taxonomy to describe strength and confidence in various sources of evidence. When I say strength of evidence, what I mean is something like reporting probability. So if you're trying to report on strength of attribution evidence, you might say that it's very unlikely or very likely that Ruritania ordered these actions, and a lot of different measures in between. A degree of confidence, however, is kind of like reporting error bars. So you could say, I'm reporting this, it's very unlikely, but I have low confidence. Or it's possible, but I have kind of a medium confidence or limited confidence. Or it's very likely and I have super high confidence. As you report strength of evidence and your confidence levels, I recommend that you stick to words. Avoid the temptation to try to report these ideas in numerical measures. A lot of people don't have an intuitive grasp of percentage measures, and if you use some kind of a raw scalar measure, those tend to convey a false sense of precision. And basically, almost everybody who's asked, how confident are you, it's surprising how often people say, well, it's 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. It's really easy to miscommunicate your opinion about the evidence by using these kinds of measures, particularly when you're trying to convey your message under pressure. There are a number of existing taxonomies that you could use. Various intelligence services have developed taxonomies of strength and confidence in evidence, and some private sector organizations have as well. Do your research, find out how people report this information, find something that works for you, and use it consistently. What's most important is that your team all adopts a common method of reporting confidence and strength of evidence. As you report the results of your analysis, try to paint some kind of a picture. And remember that decision makers, and in this case I really mean judges, but in the real world they're decision makers, they usually want a really short summary at the start. They want to know what you think right up front. So you might want to find a creative way to do that, both when you're producing written work product and when you're making your oral presentation. You should not try to create what I've called here an artificial narrative. You can't impose a sense of order on the evidence if the evidence doesn't support that. However, at the same time, you ought to try to broaden your focus in an effort to summarize what you know. And so the way that I've tried to describe that here is, don't just recite a description of individual trees. Describe what you think the forest might look like. In working with evidence, I think the most common mistakes I've seen in the competition, and in the real world for that matter, is when people get ahead of the evidence. Remember, this is not a Hollywood script. You're not trying to predict what happens in Act 2 because you just had a chance to read Act 1. In the real world, and the competition organizers know this, things just come up unexpectedly sometimes. So you might get a strong hint in round 1 that something's going to happen, and then be completely surprised in round 2. So you never quite know what's going to happen next. Only go so far as the evidence carries you. Remember, you're allowed to draw reasonable inferences, but make sure you know the difference between direct evidence and an inference. A second common mistake, and this seems to happen a lot, people who fight the scenario. Just take the scenario as you find it. If you see an expert report in the intelligence pack and you have some experience with that particular type of vendor, and you say to yourself, I just can't believe that someone would write a report in these terms. Or you find a report from an intelligence agency that's given to you that reports about a particular thing that happens. And you say, I can't believe something like that would happen. Well, you have to take the reports on their own terms. So if you want to question the credibility of evidence, that's one thing. But don't fight the scenario. The scenario planners have spent a lot of time putting work into the scenario. A third common mistake, failure to prioritize. Remember that part of your analysis and part of your opinion involves segregating what's most important from what's least important. So make sure to escalate what you feel is most important and decide what it is that makes it most important. Is it because this is something that it presents the greatest risk or the highest impact with a low risk? Whatever it happens to be, establish a priority scheme, and remember you have a limited amount of time in front of the decision maker, in front of the judge, and make sure to get the most important things that you think are important up front. So let's talk a little bit about the context that you need to absorb in order to really get the most out of this competition. Obviously, technology is an important part of the competition, so you're going to need to work to make sure you understand the nature of any technical expert report that you find in the intelligence pack, as well as potential real-world impact of the threats described. Now, be assured, you don't need to be a student of computer science or network engineering or cryptography in order to compete successfully, but you might want to talk to a few of these folks, or you might to invite someone from that world onto your team. You're not going to get very far in the competition unless you have some kind of an intuitive sense of how law and public policy applies in this field. So you're going to need a working knowledge of public international law, and I think it will be helpful for you to have a working knowledge of at least basic laws concerning computer crime. Now, I've shown pictures here of a couple of easy sources for you to look at. The Cybersecurity Body of Knowledge, the section on law and regulation, is a free resource that anybody can download at no charge, and it's a good sort of on-ramp to the subject, especially if you've never studied law before. Now, once you've read that, you could jump then to the Talon Manual 2.0, which is a fantastic resource. Now remember, the Talon Manual 2.0 is widely used in the field of cyber operations. It is not a statement of law as such. It is, however, a consensus view of a very large group of international experts on how they believe international law will apply to cyber operations. So even though I don't think there are any individual governments that adopt the manual as a statement of policy, they all look at it very closely, and you should become very familiar with the Talon Manual, especially their discussion, which is very helpful, on rules concerning attribution and response levels depending on the nature of actions taken by cyber operators. Once again, you don't need to be a student of law or international relations or political science, but you might want to talk to a few or invite one of them onto your team. You're also going to need to upskill in some area of what I'm calling cyber operations know-how. And by this, I mean make sure that you've researched and you already understand how cybersecurity problems are reported and remedied in the real world. That means you're going to need to get a basic understanding of the roles of various players both in government and in the private sector where cybersecurity incidents are concerned. Now, I've given you sort of like a smattering of some of these agencies in public sector, as well as just a pseudo-random list of private sector organizations that often get involved in understanding and escalating problems to do with cybersecurity. I don't mean to suggest that you need to be intimately familiar with how all of these work, but you do need to understand the landscape of who does what when a cyber emergency arises and how they work with each other. Now, this is actually an area where the various competitions around the world tend to diverge from one another. And that's because although the Atlantic Council framework is consistently the same between the competitions, the actual briefing requirement is a bit different. So if you're competing in the London competition, usually in the past the competition organizer has said that your role is to brief somebody in Downing Street or somebody in Cabinet Office who's about to brief the Prime Minister, or you're told you're about to brief the Prime Minister. So in that context, you would need to be very familiar with UK government agencies and mechanisms of international cooperation that are unique to the UK. Whereas if you were to compete in Washington, D.C. or someplace else in the U.S., you would probably be focusing a lot more of your time on the various roles played by the National Security Agency, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and the wide variety of agencies in the U.S. that deal with cybersecurity problems, as well as some of the international organizations like NATO or Five Eyes. If you were competing in Geneva, on the other hand, the brief is, when I was there, was to brief a multinational panel about possible methods of collaboration and multilateral response, which means that at that point you're focusing much more heavily on international organizations and how they might cooperate. So depending on which competition you're in will depend on how you focus your efforts in trying to understand relevant know-how. To get the most out of this competition, you really need to get an intuitive sense of the social and political context of a cyber incident. So make sure to factor in the real-world, let's say non-cyber aspects of the problem and address those as needed. You don't need to be a politician, but you need to consider the pressures that political leaders are going to face, and consider the broadest possible variety of responses from the state as well as from the private sector. I mean, to give you a simple example of this, if a cyber incident has disrupted the supply chain for food distribution, and you're told there's a significant risk that people in the country will start going hungry in 36 hours, you have much bigger problems to worry about than an 18-month remedial process to worry about changing an operating system. You really need to focus your efforts on the immediate social and political context and look for a variety of responses that might be cyber or non-cyber in orientation. Similarly, you need to learn to be realistic about timescales and priority. The strongest responses that I've seen in the competition are from teams that will provide short, medium, and long-term responses. And even if they don't play to all three of those time frames, they at least clearly demonstrate an understanding of how long it takes to do something. So if, for example, one of your suggestions is, we want to build a whole series of economic incentives to have better training in secondary schools, and you think you're going to get that in the course of 3 weeks, that's, I would suggest to you, not a realistic public policy agenda. There are some things that can be done very quickly, and there are some things that take a lot more time to develop. So at some point, you're going to have to present your ideas. You have to present them in writing, and you have to present them in person. First of all, make sure you know the difference between these three things. Analysis is your first job in this competition, to analyze and try to understand what is going on. Your second job is to make recommendations. Remember, your role in the competition, and a role that many people in this field play in the real world, is to advise decision makers. So your second job is to make recommendations. Usually that's a variety of recommendations. You might choose 2, 3, 4, whatever it happens to be. Try to give somebody a menu of options. But then this third thing is very different, and that is advocating, or dare I say, attempting to engineer a specific outcome. There's a very delicate line to walk when presenting a work product like this between providing your opinion and providing options, as opposed to attempting to steer or force or arm twist a decision maker to a specific outcome. And history suggests, and I've seen it happen in the competition as well, that nothing makes a decision maker angry more quickly than thinking that an expert who's meant to be advising them is in fact trying to make them operate by remote control to a specific outcome. So be very cautious that you are honest with your analysis, that you give sort of an honest spread of recommendations and try to make it realistic so that the decision maker can choose amongst and between those various recommendations without feeling like they've been steered to an inevitable result. Never underestimate the ability of a decision maker to make a decision that you're not expecting. In presenting your ideas, context is king. Try to summarize your findings up front. The judges in the competition, very much like real decision makers in the real world, will have very little chance to understand or absorb what you're thinking or what you're about to recommend before you start talking. Traditionally, the competition only gives the judges a couple of minutes to read your report before you start speaking. Now, that means you're dealing with a panel of people who are still struggling to understand what's going on. Make their job easy by giving them just a summary of what you think is going on, or give them context for what you're about to propose. I also recommend that you explain to the judges how you plan to divide your presentation time among your team members, especially if you deviate from a more or less even split. It seems to be relatively common that in a team of, if you have 10 minutes and 4 people, most teams seem to divide their time up between 2.5 minutes per person. Remember, you have to come in on time. I have, however, seen a couple of circumstances where a team deviates from this, and they explain to the panel that, this person's going to go long, or they're going to spend more time, these other people will spend a shorter time, but they then went on to explain that that's because the domain expertise tends to suggest that we split our time up this way, and our domain experts who are coming later will probably spend most of their time answering your questions during the Q&A. Whatever the explanation is, just set the expectations of the judges if you're going to do anything other than more or less an even split, because otherwise you'll see them fidgeting and getting a little bit nervous as to, why haven't we heard from team member number 3 or team member number 4? When it comes time to do questions and answers, a couple of things that sound kind of basic, but people still get it wrong. First of all, answer the question. Seriously, having judged a number of competitions like this in other settings, there's nothing more annoying than asking a question and not getting an answer to the question. So even if it's uncomfortable, or even if the answer is, I don't know, or we're not sure, or the evidence is unclear, make sure that you at least answer the question and then go on and fill in the blanks as to how you came to that answer. So if you believe that evidence is weak, don't be afraid to say so. Don't let the judge draw you into a statement you can't support. Remember, the judges, amongst other things in this competition, they're trying to figure out how to assess your knowledge of the package, and they also want to assess how confident you are in your own assessment. So it's very common to see judges that will try to draw you into making a stronger statement or a weaker statement than you started with, because they're trying to test the boundaries of how far they can go. And if you're a people pleaser, if you just decide that, well, I'm going to make something because it's clear that this person wants me to say something, that's a really quick way to lose points and to wipe out in the competition, and I've seen it happen more than once with a number of different teams. Speak as a team. You need to avoid the appearance of disagreement unless there's some kind of a real emergency in terms of how your information is being presented. And that means that when somebody gives their presentation, or if one of your team members answers a question, you probably ought to just let that one go for the time being. If it was even close to being in the realm of correct, you might want to consider just letting it pass. And the reason I say that is I've seen more than one team that will lose credibility and lose points because they end up in what I call the Columbo trap. And that is, a judge will ask a question. One of your teammates will give an answer. And then teammate number 2 says, I just add one more thing to that. And that thing is, and they go on for a minute. And then in one case, I even saw teammate number 3 who said, I want to add something to that. I've got one more thing to add. Well, I think what happens, and there's a terrible temptation for this, is that in the heat of competition, people hear an answer and they think, hey, I'm an expert on this too. I know even more than that. So let me just add one more fact or one more bit of analysis or try to clarify something that I think that person didn't say particularly well. And at that point, the only thing you're doing is competing against your own teammates. You're not really correcting an important point in the record. You are giving the impression that there's disagreement and disharmony within the team. Now, if you say, well, that's just a competition issue, isn't it? Well, in the real world, when you see a team of people doing a project or briefing like this, and you see that kind of uncertainty, as a decision maker, you think, well, have these people really got it together? Have they really come to a harmonized view on this? Have they really spent the time? Have they really done the homework to figure out amongst themselves what they think about this? Maybe I ought to send them back to a room someplace to do some more work. So there is a real-world corollary to this. I wanted to spend just a few minutes on the process of choosing a team and choosing a coach, if you haven't done these two things already. In creating a team, I would urge you to try to develop a team that shares a common vision about why they're all participating. Try to find a team that shares a common understanding of how much advanced preparation is involved. Different people come to the competition with different expectations. And if you're the sort of person who wants to spend a day a week, every week for 5 weeks, or whatever it happens to be, on this competition, or it's turning into 20-25%. I mean, if you're super gung-ho about the amount of effort you want to invest in this thing, and it turns out one of your teammates is just sort of like I thought it would be like a couple of hours one week and then there's nothing else to do, you're going to have a huge amount of tension on your team and a huge lack of consistency, and it's just going to be a really uncomfortable situation. So try to find some people who share a common vision about what you're trying to achieve. Try to bring in a variety of relevant domain experts. Try to spread your net widely and get people involved who have different points of view, different educational backgrounds, maybe even from different departments at your university. Equally important, try to find people who are likely to work well together. This competition begins with some pressure, and then it creates more pressure, and then even more pressure. So if you are already on the outs with each other, if you're already having difficulty working well together, the competition is just going to cause a breakdown. If you have a choice when recruiting a coach, I would urge you to find someone, first of all, who is enthusiastic about the competition. Find someone who shares your vision, your passion for why the competition is a valuable exercise. Try to find a coach who's going to help you identify gaps in your knowledge, who's going to be able to point you to some learning resources. Find someone who can assist you or who can suggest people who can assist you when it comes time to practice your presentation and when it comes time to practice your questions and answers. And I would urge you to find someone who is able to attend the competition with you. Historically, the way the competition has been structured is that the team's coach is allowed to sit in the room while the team is doing their presentation and answering questions from judges. Now, the coach needs to sit out of the sight of the team members, obviously, but they're in the room and they can watch the back and forth. You then are asked to leave the room for a while, and that's because the judges will spend some time conferring and marking up their score sheets. You're then invited back into the room, and your coach once again is allowed to sit down with you. And when you go back into the room, that's when you get the feedback from the judges. And by the way, here's a pro tip. Don't fight with the judges when they give you feedback. They've already filled out their score sheets. There's nothing to be gained. Just listen to them. Just take the notes, write them down, smile and nod, even if you disagree with what's going on. Now, this is where the coach becomes really helpful. Once you leave the room again, sit down with your coach, because that's the only person in the room who wasn't busy giving a presentation asking questions, answering questions, and filling out score sheets. That's the person who can sit and give you that third-party view about what just happened, because that session will happen. You'll be under huge pressure, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to remember the moment by moment of what went on. When you go to find a coach, be prepared to explain to that person why you want to participate. Explain what you hope to accomplish. Explain why you believe it's a valuable complement to your studies, because being a coach for this competition can be significantly disruptive, depending on the nature of the coaching relationship that you want to form. Now, don't get me wrong, different teams have been very successful by having a very light touch relationship with a coach. They've been very self-motivated and didn't want that much intervention. If that works for you and your team, fantastic. However, if you are trying to use the competition to work into and learn a lot about an area about which you know very little, then I think that a coach can really help you with that process. So now some final thoughts for you, some just last things to think about. Competition top tips. Top tip number 1 sounds obvious: be a good team. Now, I don't just mean perform at the top of the league table. I mean function well. Try to bring multiple disciplines to your team. Collaborate with one another. Cooperate with one another. Find a way to work together very, very effectively. That's what I mean by be a good team. Second, pick a good coach. Now, in this case, I mean the right coach for your team. Not every coach works the same way. Not every team needs the same coach. So find someone that will provide best value and best guidance for your team. Tip number 3, read the rules. For heaven's sake, read the competition rules, then read them again. And by the way, after you've read them a second time, read them a third time. Make sure you understand what you're being asked to do. Make sure to deliver what you've been asked to deliver, and make sure that you deliver it on time. That is critical. Tip number 4, spend some time reviewing past briefing papers. Historically, the Atlantic Council has uploaded submissions from different teams in different competitions, and they're worth giving a quick look at, not because you want to copy them. I mean, one of the things that's most interesting when you look at those past papers is to see how very different they all are. Even the ones that have won awards as sort of, best briefing paper or whatever the award happens to be for the competition, it's really fascinating to see how very different and how very creative they can be. So when it comes time to write your own reports, consider your own creative method of presenting your analysis and your recommendations. Tip number 5, don't get ahead of the evidence. Decide what you believe you know, and then, and only then, discuss your range of responses. I think one of the things that I see teams do is they get ahead of themselves. They jump to responses. What should we do about this? And that's a real disaster, because if you start by discussing your responses, suddenly your disagreements about what the evidence says starts to come out late in the process, and then you're rushing around trying to correct your understanding. And sometimes an intelligence pack, both in this competition and I'm told in the real world, sometimes the most important thing you learn might be buried somewhere. It might be a very subtle point that's only hinted at someplace, and you have to kind of tease it out. So, of the teams that I've coached, I used to drive them crazy, because when they would read the intelligence pack, I would say, okay, I would read it too, but I would say, okay, tell me what you think is going on. And they would start telling a story. And as soon as somebody said, well, this has happened, I would say, what's your evidence for that? Why do you believe that has happened? Why do you believe thing A happened? Why do you believe thing B happened? Why do you believe thing C happened? Is there any other explanation for what happened? And it used to drive them just a little bit nuts. But what it did do is it started to bed in that skill set of what we do as a group is that exercise with each other. Let's challenge each other on what we think we know, so that by the time it comes to, but when it's time to discuss responses and when it's time to brief judges or to brief decision makers, they really had a very harmonized view of what the evidence sort of like fair inferences that could be drawn from the evidence presented to them. Finally, this sounds simple, but show up on time. If we're able to do a competition in person, then I recommend that you get to a hotel or something similar near the competition site the afternoon or evening before the competition. Don't try to rush in on the same morning on a commuter train. It can be really difficult. Remember, if you are there late, your panel will go ahead without you, and you don't really want that to happen. You want to be relaxed. So get there, make sure you're there on time, and frankly, relax. If you've done your job well, most of the effort goes in before you ever show up to the competition. The competition, I believe, produces a number of benefits to students. That's why I'm such a huge supporter. It gives you an opportunity to study, to research, to learn, to practice various aspects of theory and skills and procedure, know-how and decision-making in all kinds of domains like international law, international security, vulnerability disclosure, forensics, and cyber risk management. If you're a computer science student, you're going to learn something in this competition that isn't normally taught in computer science faculty. If you're a law student, you're going to learn something in this competition that doesn't normally come up at law school. Embrace that opportunity as an adjunct to your education. The competition is a simulation that forces you to synthesize a lot of complex evidence from conflicting sources. It requires you to place cybersecurity risk in a social, political, and legal context. And it requires you to understand practical operational challenges. And, on a personal level, it requires you to demonstrate some effective communication and teamwork. The competition prepares you to engage with future employers. It gives you some hands-on understanding of governance and decision-making. And I believe it makes you a more effective communicator when you're talking with persons who live outside of your domain expertise. And I think all of these are really good reasons to participate. So with that, it really just remains to say, good luck. I hope you compete, and I hope you have fun. I know you'll learn something. Bye-bye for now.